Okay, and that is all from me, so I think we can start. So without further ado, I invite the Prime Minister to start the debate. Hear, hear.
The goal of political systems is to improve people's lives through implementing meaningful policy change. In a world where political discourse is currently dominated by discussions of whether you smoked weed in the past, who your daughter is dating, and what university you went to, this makes meaningful policy far more difficult to access. And note that these tend to be the actual sexy issues that the media focuses on, rather than politically pertinent elements of your character and your identity. I'm going to start out with a model and then get into three arguments. Firstly, whether it's a trade-off with policy discussions that is more important. Secondly, why you elect worse politicians. And then thirdly, how we are better able to deal with scandal under our side of a house. Into our model. So what do we think that focusing on personal identities actually look like? Firstly, a large emphasis about what you did in the past, what job you might have had, what university you went to, what your previous political record and stuff like that might have been. Secondly, just large amounts of gossip about your life, so a lot of gossip about your family, a lot of gossip about who you dated and what you did. But thirdly, we also oppose things an overwhelming emphasis on arbitrary elements of your identity, i.e. you are the Black politician, you are the female politician, stuff like that. I think that the comparative would be a greater focus on policy discussions as opposed to your character. First argument, why is there a trade-off with policy discussions that ultimately exist? I'm just going to try and say you can still talk about policy. I have a few reasons why that cannot happen. Firstly, the media can only report on so many things during a particular time frame when there are a limited quantity of stories. Secondly, people's time span is incredibly limited, and this is a very important mechanism. People generally find watching politics very dry and boring, so if they're going to do this for half an hour, they would rather read about who your kid dated or something that's exciting to them and resembles more other kind of entertainment media as opposed to a kind of policy that may be actually relevant in terms of how they cast their vote and stuff like that. But thirdly, and this is vital, an overwhelming focus on character has changed the way that political norms are ultimately constructed. That is to say, in a world where we are told that character matters, you're more likely to arbitrarily bind to the fact that character is ultimately important, meaning that because demand for these kind of stories is higher, the media will arbitrarily self-select into discussing these particular things relative to other kind of policies that are ultimately important. And therefore, we get some kind of policy discussion, but a lot, the majority of media channels spend the majority of time talking about elements of your character, as I flagged in the intro. The comparative then becomes, why do we prefer a world where we spend substantially larger quantities of time focusing on policy as opposed to character? A few reasons for this. Firstly, character is more performative, whereas policy tends to be more constant. Character is performative because the way that you represent yourself in front of the media is based on the image that you think will sell the best and will be the most appealing to people at the end of the day. We acknowledge that campaign promises could theoretically be performative, but is less so than character. We still have to toe the party line to a great extent, right? You're a part of a party who tends to support policies on one side of the ideological spectrum, meaning that the probability of follow through is going to be substantially higher than a character that you just invent to try and get people to vote for you on the basis of likability. Secondly, policy has a more tangible impact on people's lives. Even if you're a nice guy or would be fun to have a beer with, this doesn't change the kind of policies that you're actually going to implement at the end of the day, as opposed to the kind of policies that you actually stand for. This will determine how people actually get Medicare, which school districts are ultimately funded, and therefore is far more relevant to the basis of how people actually vote, which means that we all weigh that higher because the goal of political systems is to get change that actually helps people's quality of life. But thirdly, and this is important, accountability mechanisms for following through with policy are far better under our side of a house. Why? Because when you have larger quantities of time where politicians make robust campaign promises, individuals spend more time expecting those kind of policies to be implemented because you're aware of the political platforms that different people ultimately have. When a lot of discussions about character, you're more unclear about platforms, so checks and balances are more difficult, meaning that choice is better actualized for people under our side of a house because even if you attempt to vote based on policies, like some people do, the probability that you will actually get change that betters your quality of life is substantially higher under our side of a house. Second claim, why don't we just elect better people? I think that there are three mechanisms here. The first thing to say is that likability and identity is a far more biased mechanism than meritocracy in the policies that you have. What does likability look like? It looks like who you want to have a beer with. It looks like who makes you feel the most safe. It looks like who you think had the most dignified past, who went to the best kind of educational institutions, who had the most connections and stuff like that. Before I continue, I'll take closing up.
Aspects of somebody's various family lives, their drug use in the past. These are the kinds of things perpetuated through tabloid media, and these aren't the kinds of outlets which are otherwise focusing on policy, surely.
This is not true. So even if in tablet media would focus on these things, maybe tablet media is a wash, but I think for a lot of mainstream news organizations as well, tablet media has shifted the kind of reporting that they do as well, meaning that on aggregate, you still get more reporting on policy. And at the very least under our side, tablet media will spend a greater quantity of time talking about these kinds of issues. So as I explained, likability is biased because it's often based on a gut intuition about who we tend to trust the most, which often overlaps in favor of white men who have very solid paths, right? Who went to Harvard, who were physically attractive, who are seen as just being a great politician overall. overall. Contrast that then to meritocracy, which I think is a far more consistent metric, because when you're voting on policy, this is divorced from the metric of likability and like how safe and like how you view that particular person, but rather it's just about like whether that policy will benefit your own quality of life. So this makes it a lot easier for like disprivileged groups to actually tap in and break into politics overall when you're voting on better metrics. The second thing to say here is that attack ads get far worse under their side of a house that target politicians. This is for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because individuals center their identities far more within their own campaigning, because it's normalized as a political norm, which then legitimizes other people attacking that identity, because you literally frame that as being important to how you ultimately campaign. But secondly, you legitimize attack ads to a far larger extent, where like you literally say character is relevant to how people end up voting, therefore it is justified for like other politicians to attack your character. This is bad because attack ads are often quite effective in like demonizing certain people. Like gendered attack ads against like Hillary Clinton, I think were like largely effective in withdrawing bases of support. So we prefer worlds where this does not occur to like help marginalized groups who are the most vulnerable to these kind of particular things. So both of these mechanisms prove that more marginalized people will be able to break into politics. That is good for just like more representative policy, for changing norms pertaining to these groups. I think like impacts on this are fairly intuitive if we prove it. Secondly, we also are better because we elect fewer populists within our roles. Like some populism might exist, but I think that focus on character has fueled this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, you're more likely to overlook like the horrid policies that a lot of populists have when this is not normalized. Note that like every single populist just supports really dumb things. Economic protectionism in the vast majority of cases like lowers GDP, you get fewer advantages from trade. I think a lot of people like rolling back the judiciary and like fighting democratic freedoms or just horrible policies, like banning people from coming into your state is often bad because there's often a lot of economic benefits. So you lose criticisms of the kind of bad policies that populists support because you focus a lot more on their character. But secondly, populists tend to be the most like charismatic politicians, right? They literally get into office because you're able to like speak to the common man to a far larger extent. And in a world where you value character, people are far more susceptible to like the emotionally manipulative rhetoric that populists ultimately use because you start caring about these issues to a far larger extent. Populists are bad because like erode like judicial norms, often erode democratic freedoms. You often hate minorities, stuff like that. Even if in some countries this to be symmetric, it is a net win. Finally, on the ideas of scandal. We can still talk about sexual assault and blackface under either side of a house because you're like very significant and some investigative journalism will pick up on this. But we win scandal for a couple of reasons. Firstly, a bad thing that a left-wing politician did in the past is often used to delegitimize them. I.e., like Kamala Harris had like one bad like rights record in her past, therefore we ought not vote for her. But secondly, even things like calling it sexual assault gets far worse because you have cult of personalities and therefore your own support base does not take this seriously. Ruth will expand on this to a far greater extent. Very proud to stand in opening government.
Thank you very much for this fine speech, and I invite the leader of the opposition to start the case for the opposition side. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, 2 things in this speech. Firstly, why principally this information should be in the public eye to make elections legitimate, and then secondly, on how it is very relevant to how politicians do their jobs. Now let's start with some exchange rebuttal to OG, right? Because I think they've grossly misrepresented the motion here, right? I think they start with a very false comparative on like this trade-off supposedly between policy talk and personality talk. I think there are 3 responses to this. Firstly, as I'll show you later, your past, your identity and stuff does inform your policy and how you at least act on it and how you vote once you're elected. Secondly, as CO points out in POI, there are different channels and different media for like policy and for personality. And like the response to POI, I think like journalists who take themselves seriously and want to focus on like the serious like big stories affecting the country would never like report on someone's college boyfriend or girlfriend. They would focus rather on the stories of the day. And then thirdly, I think this is not a zero-sum game, right? Because they paint it as if people stop listening to stories about policy and they move on to like personality. But I think there are a lot of people who do not care enough about politics to listen to like boring CNN debates on policy, but now do care more because they get to hear things about their favorite politicians, like personal life and their opinions, which can inform how they vote in a good way. Finally, very quickly on likability, right? I think they paint it as a big impact, but it's basically entirely symmetric, right? Because OG don't tie it to like the media reporting on your past. Likability has to do with like you being presentable, like you cracking jokes in interviews, things like that. Things that you still do on both sides of the house, basically the same. In fact, I think it's a lot worse on their side because the public has less information to know whether you're actually likable, so you have to base it more on stereotypes, i.e., are you a white man, right? I think that's much, much worse. Note that on no side of the house do you actually vote for policy. You always vote for people. That does not change. Similarly, for the exact same reasons, populists will always be able to stoke fear by talking about like people coming in, taking your jobs, the economy crashing, and other like fear-mongering tactics they used. It has nothing to do with what they did when they were 23 or who they worked for in the past. I literally do not see the relevance of this point. DPM is going to have to do a lot of rebuilding here. Now moving on to my first point on the principle, right? What the claim here is that this information must be known by the public for elections to be democratic and legitimate. Why is that? That is because democracy is about giving people a choice, right? A choice how they want to be governed, who they want to govern them, right? And as always, with any kind of choice or consent principle or debate, it's important in order to have a valid choice, right, to know what you are choosing, to have all the information, right? And I think that the critical thing to consider here is that we don't decide in democracies ever what is good information or what isn't good information, right? We give people all the information and let them make an informed choice for themselves, right? We also don't force them to accept this information, but they must have access. Here's an intuition pump, right? If there was like a country with like censored media and their elections were like otherwise fair, no one stuffed ballots, but the media was like heavily censored on what they could and couldn't report, right? That would not be a free election. Similarly, in a world where the media doesn't report on like politicians' private lives, that's not a free and fair election. What this principle means is that if we manage to show you that this information is relevant to how a politician conducts themselves in their job, right? In any way, whether it's good or bad, although we'll go for good, so we can win on two grounds, right? We win on the principle, and this motion should not be passed, like regardless of outcomes. So let's move on to the relevance here, like the practical bit. And it's important to remember here, throughout this point, I will show you multiple ways in which this information can be relevant to politicians' jobs. I will do two things with this. Firstly, fulfill the principle I've already given you, but also note that independently, each of these has practical harms in their own right, should the motion pass. And look, I'm not going to show you that any bit of information like who your daughter's boyfriend is relevant, although sometimes if your daughter's boyfriend is Jared Kushner, that is also very, very relevant, right, and should be considered. However, I will show you that by and large, most of this information can affect your job once elected. Four key mechanisms, right? Firstly, your identity and your personal opinions inform the way you vote as a politician, as a member of parliament and a member of Congress, right? You cannot divorce the person from the job. Note that if you could, as OG tries to claim, like we wouldn't have representative democracy. We'd have some kind of like AI that coalesces all of our views. The whole reason we have people in representative democracy is because we think that like the personal element matters, right? So for example, your like past views on race, your past views on the environment can affect how you vote, but also like whether you smoked weed in the past, right, can be very important to religious voters whose religion like bans any kind of substances, right? But also like if you're really, really rich, for example, or if you come from a rich Republican background, that can also mean you're more likely to like not vote for Medicare, or vote to cut health benefits, regardless of what you say in interviews. It's the key bit, right? When they talk about policy, they don't necessarily tell us exactly what they're going to do. This is important both before the election, right? When you don't know who this person is, they don't have a track record because they haven't been elected before, but also once they're in office, right? Because you never know what might come up, things that were never like planned for during their campaign, like a massive economic recession that no one foresaw due to a pandemic or an unpredictable war, right? I think this is all very relevant. Secondly, I think it's important to know what they did in the past, because this way we see that they have like a track record of competence, right? They may not have always been politicians, but we want to see that they were good, right? For example, if someone used to run companies and bankrupt them left, right, and center, and like was involved in several fraud scandals, like Donald Trump, right? You probably want to know that before deciding not to vote for him. His talk on policy might be great because he has like a shit ton of advisors, right? But you still know that this person destroyed like several companies, might destroy the economy as well. Thirdly, right? There are several potential conflicts of interest that this information helps uncover, right? Note firstly that many politicians, and especially high-level politicians, for like president, prime minister, those jobs, right, tend to be privileged. That means they've been on company boards, they've been on international business stuff. This means that their past is more open to shady dealings. Before we see the impact of this, I'll take a PI from CG if you have one. No? Cool. Okay, moving on. So this means they're more open to shady dealings in the past, like an illegal merger they were involved in, or like burning the rainforest with their company, or things like that. This is important for two reasons. Firstly, because those, like, they may pander to like this company. If someone has a background in like the oil business, like Rex Tillerson when he became Secretary of State, he may very well pander to them, and like that's something we should know. But also, secondly, those who know about your shady dealings from the past now have an ability to blackmail you. They say, look, I'll reveal what you did in, I don't know, Vietnam, unless you like don't pass this law or pass this law or whatever benefits them. This is really, really bad because it makes them accountable to these people who we don't even know about and not the public. It goes against the whole like point of politics. It's the same reason why we force politicians to disclose exactly who donates to their campaign and by how much. Literally the exact same sort of principle there. And then finally, I think politicians also act as role models for the rest of society, right? we want to see them setting the law and like also following it and being punished if they don't. I think the media criticizing them when they don't follow the law themselves leads to them being punished. Take, for example, the Scottish health minister, right, who flouted the lockdown rules there and went to their second home. They were forced to resign because of the media pressure. That is literally something that does not exist on Gov's side of the house, right? I think it's important to hold politicians to a higher standard, and we do this on our side. This information is not just like random gossip. It's strictly relevant to how they conduct themselves once in office, and I'm very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fine speech. And to continue the case on the government side, I invite the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Okay. Oh wait, let me just open the chat so I can see people. So I think opening op has a massive flaw in this debate, where they focus the majority of their case on saying that personality is necessary to inform like who a politician is, yet never once try and even prove a link between how personality actually affects your policy, other than saying it might in some like arbitrary mannerism. And the second thing to note here is they never once tell you why it is that the media is likely to talk about characteristics that are actually important to your policy. This is to say, there are tons of media corporations who just do the thing that will get them the most like profit and the most like clickbaity type news, which means the very things like focusing on like your like crazy like girlfriend from the past, or focusing on like the fact that you might have done drugs, and a lot of people are going to click onto this and read these type of articles. I tell you that I'm going to prove to you three things. First, on why there is an explicit trade-off and why the types of things that get covered are better on our side. Second of all, I'm going to talk about like why we don't think we actually need to cover you as a person, but why when we do have this focus it is actively worse. And then third, I'm going to talk about policy, and then lastly I'll talk about voter engagement, in case like Closing Op wants to talk about that later in their speech. Okay, first on the trade-off. So OO says that like tabloids are the ones that are focusing on you as a person, and don't like and aren't going to like alternatively focus on policy, whereas like other articles are going to focus on the good type of like persona. So a few things on like all this holistically. The first is just noting why there is a trade-off. So I'd say there's a trade-off in a few ways. The first is a trade-off between what these companies try and cover. This is to say that tabloid status quo might focus on things like your personality traits, but given that people a lot of people do want to go out and vote and be engaged in politics, I'd say in a world in which there was less of a norm to focus on personality traits, they'd still want to capture the profit basis off of voters, and so they'd have incentive to flip to a focus on policy. But the second thing I would note here is on the easeability of policy. This is to say that the type of policy that gets covered right now is often a lot harder because the uninformed voter can easily just read articles of like who someone is as a person to inform their vote. Now, when you have less of a focus on this, in order to get informed, they're going to want articles that are published regarding policy, but easy to interpret policy. This is to say we're more likely to get media, like journalists covering policy, but in like easier to interpret lenses for people to be able to focus on that. The second thing I would talk to you about is like trade-offs that are not just within the media that OO wants to claim. I'd say there's also like trade-offs in the resources that you allocate during your campaign. This is to say there's inherent trade-off between making like campaign advertisements about someone as a person versus the policies that they have. There's thirdly a trade-off between what like people view. So like they say that like some people like to like care about we'd say that like some people aren't going to like watch like debates about policy, but also read articles on who you are as a person. Most people spend like minimal time. The last thing I'd say is implicit biases when people go out to vote do have trade-offs. So like most like studies on like how people tend to vote like focus on the implicit biases that people have when they go out to vote. These are usually the like last few things that they saw in the media or things that are most like closest to them in their life. This is to say when you frame character as very important to people, that is going to undermine what they implicitly think about when they go out to a polling station or when they read up on news. When we flip that and we get more of a norm on focusing on policy, you're now going to think about the policies that most directly affect you, which means that like we posit that under the status quo, people don't vote in their own best interest, and we need to flip the way that they implicitly think in order to get them to do so. That only happens when you shift the trade-off that exists to our side and get more of a focus on policy. That is why that exists. That is why we get better coverage on policy. So if OP, even in their best case, cares about policy at all, I just gave you a bunch of reasons to why we get policy that's easier to inform to people, why we shift their implicit biases so they actually are willing to understand it and so that they care about it. Second clash then on people and if we care about them. I would note here that a lot of the material that OP has is prefaced on the character traits that you're getting actually being good. So a few things on this. I will take them at their best, although I'd note that like oftentimes I think this looks like covering the socks that like Trudeau wore to a convention rather than the policies discussed, not covering necessarily him as a person. But let's take OP at their best case and say we cover important characteristics. A few reasons why we say this is actually bad. First is I think this often leads to discrimination in the type of person that you focus on. This is to say that Naomi talks to you about how oftentimes you focus on attributes like the color of your skin or the background you had, or like you are like attribute like more masculine characteristics that are usually looked at as being like more politician-y. So what are harms of this? The first is we have the impact of like less representation within politics, because you see these types of people as being better politicians. So we see this means you lose buy-in from people who now no longer see governments as people representing them. This looks like losing the buy-in of like indigenous peoples in Canada or people of color in the United States when you continuously see like white like men getting into office. I'd say this means that even if closing wants to run an extension on like getting more voter engagement, we'd say you lose a lot of engagement at the point at which you never show someone representative of you in media, because characteristics are always going to focus on like who is the most like white rich man with a privileged background. That is the exact same like thing that like characteristics are focused on today. So the discriminatory type of focus we have loses voter engagement. It is unclear to me that that's actually a net win for the opposite. Second thing I would note here is oftentimes this is used disproportionately by the right and the left. So oftentimes when the right uses this to call out scandals to harm the left. So they call it things like maybe assault cases, but they also call it things like, I don't know, like economic scandals. The problem is when tactics are used to call out the right, people on the right don't actively care. So this looks like in the United States, calling out like Trump for assault had a very different effect than calling out Biden, where he actually like lost support from progressive people, or like the same thing that happened with like calling out Trudeau for blackface in Canada. So we'd say that like this is to say that it's used disproportionately, so that any scandal that Op wants to talk about just hurts progressive politicians from getting into office, because it's used more so to harm progressive politicians than it is actually used to harm conservative politicians. So it's an asymmetric thing. So if they care about people being able to vote on the same grounds, I tell you then we probably should care about people being able to evenly see policy versus you unevenly see, like people unevenly attribute personal characteristics. So therefore media should probably focus on the thing that is cross-applied best to everyone. The third thing, yeah, so that's why we say that like inherently you don't need that. Okay, next on policy, I would note here that literally all of OO that focuses on the fact that people are best for knowing what your policy is. We posit a bunch of things in response to this. So the first thing I would just say is that they give actually no reason as to why it is the case that you are like who you are as a person is going to lead to the best policy. I'm going to give you a bunch of reasons as to why I actually think it's the flip. So first, I would note that as Naomi pointed out to you, that like oftentimes the policies that you discuss are more like able to hold you accountable, but they're also good for things like shifting like the window of what people like are desire from politicians, because they're more like they're more aware of what policies are, and they're more likely to encourage their politicians to enact them. I'd also add on to this that like the reason why we care more about policy is it gives you a priority schema of what someone's going to enact in office. So even if this person is really nice, and even if I say that they're like a female person of color, I actually don't know that the thing they're going to prioritize once they're in office is like defunding the police or like solving for gendered issues, right? So that's why we tell you that a shift on policy is more important, because it tells people like the priorities that someone will have in office. So I note that like even in the best case where opposition is able to prove to you that your persona might matter, we tell you that if you're not able to hold politicians accountable and you don't know what their priorities will be, the vote that you end up making is going to be bad. Last thing on weighing, I tell you that like oftentimes, even in their best case where they get more people voting, those people are uninformed and they don't have policies to hold people accountable. So we weigh getting more informed voters who can cast their ballot over like more uninformed people. Very proud to stand on OG.
Thank you very much for this fine speech. And to continue the case on the opposition side, I invite the deputy leader of the opposition. Here. Thank you very much for this fine speech. And to extend the case on the government side, I invite the member of the government. Here.
Okay. This debate is about personal identity and the private actions of politicians. And this goes way beyond the scandals just that our opening have talked about. Instead, it's about the personal lifestyle someone decides to do, maybe their sexuality, maybe their religious beliefs, maybe parts of their identity. These are all actions that are not at all linked in any way to their role as a politician. Therefore, by judging them as these, by using these metrics to judge their ability to be a politician is not only a bad metric to begin with, but we're just not justifiable by any metric. In our counterfactual, I think we prefer instead to judge people based off their voting record, the policies they produce, and the actions they do as politicians. But also this does count as choices you made in your professional life. So if you were a banker that went bankrupt lots of times in your previous business, as our opening opposition wants to talk about, I think that falls under this metric. And also if you are so biased in your opinions and actually are really racist, these will be reflected in your policy making. Therefore, that also falls under this metric. So I think all the counter narratives OO talk about why the two are inextricable, I just don't think fall in this debate. If you are a politician that has these deep-seated biases, to the point where it is going to impact your role as a politician, that falls under this motion because it will likely be reflected in the policies you pursue. Similarly, if you are corrupt and have donation things in your professional life, I think this also falls under the policy. This policy is particularly about personal identity and private actions that politicians do not, that are not linked to someone's political role. An example is, for example, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is a very conservative Christian. Yeah, he says that as a prime minister, his role is not to incorporate religion into his beliefs. Or perhaps if you are just things like that, where it's not necessarily something you want to push forward in policy, it's not part of your image as a politician, but just your own personal things. We just think it is fundamentally legitimate to ever discriminate anyone based off these values and beliefs. Liberal democracy is all about having the freedom to express yourself, to be whatever sexuality or religion you want. And you cannot discriminate on people based off these decisions. I asked in a POI about a lawyer because ultimately a politician's role is just a job at the end of the day. I think lawyers also have a huge amount of power over a person's life. Politicians also have a role of the person's life. Therefore, they should be judged of the metric of how well they do that job and complete that job. And the only fair way to do that is things like how well they represent their electorate, how fairly they vote in elections. I think when their views and identities are completely independent of their voting track record, then we just think it is fundamentally unjust to discriminate on them based off that job. The example being like, I think that would be fundamentally opposed to do so. Because I think whilst we all have some implicit biases to begin with, and perhaps there is some implicit things we cannot disconnect from our other roles, I think that is the same for any job you do. For any job you do, whether it's a lawyer, a position of power, a banker, everyone has some degree of implicit biases that they cannot extract. However, I don't really see why politicians per se have to be massively discriminated against based off the things that people can't control. When I think all of the bulk of the harms of those biases likely be in their policy making to begin with. So I think what this likely happens is that marginal groups just get excluded. I think if you are a gay person in a conservative country running for office, and now the media decides to focus on that personal identity of yours, I think it's far more less likely you will ever be voted in as a politician, because now you're not seen as a politician, you're seen as a gay politician. I think that many people have problems with. I think if you are maybe more religious and have more conservative views, I think it's likely that people will no longer look at the policies you make, but rather discriminate on you based off that. So I think it's just an easy way for you to get more elitist white male politicians. And when more diverse groups no longer get included because they are being discriminated against based off their personal decisions that perhaps are not palatable for the majority of the population. But I think finally, it just undermines the purpose of representative democracy. Because I disagree with what Hannah said, because I don't understand, because Hannah says a lawyer's job is to represent you, but it's exactly what the role of a politician's role is to do. A role of a politician is to represent the views of its electorate. It is not to vote based off its own conscious alone. I disagree with OO when they say the reason why we have people and not AI is because we trust their value judgments and beliefs. I disagree. I think actually it's because people have the ability to balance lots of views from their electorate and come up with a compromise based off multiple views. They have greater empathy and intelligence than a machine. But this doesn't mean they are suddenly able to vote based off their own personal values and beliefs. For example, if there are huge protests against an important issue and governments decide to ignore it, yes, it happens, but it is fundamentally undemocratic and something we do not stand behind. And I think the reason why this often exists is because of this focus on personal identity that I will later explain. Because why is this so important? Because I think, as Hannah says, governments have enormous power over our lives. They control every aspect of it, have the ability to completely restrict our liberty. Such powers can only be justified through consent. And there's two ways they do this consent. First is for elections, when you produce manifestos with lists of policies that people vote on. But the second way is through continuous consultation, like surgeries, e-petitions, and receiving lectures. Why? Because new issues will arise that fall out of the manifesto that they can't foresee. Elections are every 4 years. Therefore, it's impossible to maintain that high level of consent among those time. However, I think the problem is when you have this focus, when you have this narrative that focuses on personal identity instead, I think it disincentivizes politicians to continually consult with their electorate. Why? Because now do not believe that they're elected based off the policies that they like, or because they believe they can act as a mouthpiece for the population. I think now it's like, look, we voted for you because we like you as a person, we like your beliefs, we like your personal identity and what you personally stand for. It in many ways creates a cult following around this personality and around this image, and has a fan base. An example is Trump, for example. People don't vote for him based off his concrete policies. It's his image of I alone will drain the swamp and I alone will do this. I think what this does is it gives him massive leeway as a person now to have enormous confidence within his own personal beliefs and be able to vote for things without consulting anyone. I'll take a POI from opening opposition.
You say that we should judge politicians based on past voting records and policies. What about people running for office for the first time? Do you think no one should vote for them because they've got no track record and are the most likely to be minorities or women?
I don't think we should only vote based off voting track record at all. I think we should vote people based off the policies of their manifesto. So if you don't have a voting track record, there are many other avenues you can do so by saying, look, they've got great policies, I'm going to vote for her. I think that's a great thing to stand behind. However, okay, back to what I was saying. I think the problem now is when you have this narrative that we vote on politicians based off their identity and their values and beliefs, I think it incentivizes them now to make these value judgment calls and do not make them feel empowered to have this greater license to boast off personal beliefs, and it has created this social norm. I think you get far less representative politicians because they now no longer have that social norm where they need to consult with their electorate and actually do so. I think this massively undermines government legitimacy, the point at which politicians can now make their own decisions. I think on the comparative, you have a more policy focus driven, where a politician knows they are voted in solely based off their policies. When a new issue arises that perhaps didn't fall under their manifesto, they're more likely to think, right, maybe I should hold a surgery with my local constituents and ask what they think and actually deal with this in a more representative way, as opposed to being like, well, they love me, they are my fans, they believe in me because of my conservative values, therefore I'm going to make a conservative judgment call based off this. I think that makes far greater representative policies on what democracy is about and provides a key framing that our opening missed. For all those reasons, proud to propose.
Thank you very much for this fine speech. And to introduce the last team into the debate, I invite the member of the opposition. Here.
Hello. And if I could ask as far as possible if I could be offered POIs in the chat, that would be great. Okay, panel, a few things in this speech. Firstly, 2 key points of framing, which I think are missing from this debate, and then 3 points of extension. Firstly, on engagement with issues with regard to politicians' actions, how they play out in the media. Secondly, the effect on minority individuals from minority groups running for office. And then thirdly and finally, a note on moral governance and why this is the most preferable option. Before that, one brief point of extraneous rebuttal on what we've just heard from closing. They try and push this intuition pump about how if in any other job, in any other walk of life, you don't get held to this standard, so why should you in politics? 2 things on this. Firstly, the trend in the modern day, when our past private actions are far more visible than ever and liable to follow up via social media, via camera phones recording things, and awareness more generally, we think it actually is the case in the vast majority of jobs in the modern world that people are held up to the mistakes they've made in the past, and people are called upon to either apologize or resign if they have done wrong things in the past. We don't think there's an inconsistency here. But secondly, even if that wasn't true, it matters in particular for politicians because they shape the world we all have to live in. They have a direct effect on the world around them. So if they have done things wrong in the past, then it is absolutely right that they are not able to cause damage to our society by inflicting those biases, by inflicting those views, by inflicting those mistakes on other people. 2 points of framing which are missing so far. I think to counter the framing which OG tries to push on us, I think there are two ways in which people consume media about politicians, and I think those separate into 2 categories thusly, right? Tabloid and gossip-focused media are the kinds of media outlets which cover drug use, family issues, these sorts of not really important within the scope of politics things. So we think the media we're actually talking about changing in this debate is the media which would otherwise focus on issues, which tabloid and gossip media just aren't interested in. We think the kinds of things which these which these more serious media organizations focus on are things like personal character, their temperament, are they fit to govern, are they ready for the pressure of office, things like honesty, have they always told the truth in the past, are they likely to be telling truth to you this election cycle, and then about things they've done in the past, their experience, whether they are capable of fulfilling the role, and their consistency, have they always been fighting for what they currently proclaim to believe in. Secondly, on framing, I think what's important to recognize is how most people actually consume information about policy, right? Simply because of restrictions like time and attention, people do not sit like a debates judge, like tapping away at their utility calculator and working out whether the policy will be net good or net bad. We think people generally get an impression of the kinds of things which a politician is going to stand behind and push for. It's all an impression. The best that can ever get across to voters is an impression about the kinds of things these politicians are interested in. That's important to remember. Okay, so moving on to engagement, right? It is much more engaging for people to talk about people over things. It's just easier for people to empathize with a person, their approach, their experience, their views, over analyzing abstract concepts in their head, right? We think that this plays out particularly with regard to progressive causes on social issues, right? Showing examples of people who are at the epicenter of the decision-making which takes place in our society, making examples out of mistakes they've made in the past, right? Is a key way in which we can get across to voters and get across to society in general the kinds of changes which need to be made in our world. It's when we see Justin Trudeau in blackface and we call him out on that, and he has to apologize and be sincere and clear in what he apologizes for doing and why it was so wrong. And when people commentate on that and point out how it is wrong, that has twofold benefits. It holds those politicians to account, it holds those politicians to account, and it provides a demonstration to other people. This is unique to politicians because these kinds of things cannot be dismissed as simply like not important to the public because everyone should be able to live their own lives. These are uniquely important because what the actions of politicians affect us all, and people aren't able to dismiss it as just part of their lives. Before I move on to minority groups, I'll take a point of information if anyone has one.
I have one from opening.
Yeah.
Okay. So the focus on characteristics of people is often discriminatory in nature, and I already responded to this in DPM, telling you that this leads to a loss of voter engagement when people don't feel represented in politics, which is to say this drops your argument on engagement. But also you should weigh people having access to policy and accountability of politicians over this.
On minority groups, because that was the core of your first POI. Minority groups and individuals is what I'm moving on to, right? Because I think it's important to recognize that minorities experience unique difficulties in the context of our society. Unique difficulties which can most clearly be combated and can be helped with through the policies introduced by governance, right? However, structural bias stops these people from rising in significant numbers into politics when it's just left up to individuals' political maneuvering, right? We think that when somebody does, from these minority groups and from these difficult backgrounds, finally does break through, it's important for these people to be able to highlight to voters who they are and what they've been through, right? This means, right, that the people are more likely to turn out and vote because finally it's not just another posh prick who's gone to the best universities and who's done everything and had everything handed to them on a silver platter. This is somebody who's actually experienced the tough things in their lives, right? Like when I am from a background that means I have lived in publicly funded housing, I have gone to publicly funded schools, I have only been able to access publicly funded healthcare. I believe that somebody who has had to use all of those services actually understands what needs to be done to improve those services and therefore improve my life. Nobody who doesn't experience those can give me the impression that they actually understand and they actually believe. This only comes when the focus is directed at these kinds of things, because when the focus is directly on those issues, it is only at that point that we explore beyond the base level virtue signaling which government side like to disparage, right? It is only when we focus on these issues of what difficulties did you actually go through. Let's talk about that. Let's devote an interview to that we go beyond just I am from this minority background, so vote for me. That's the only point at which we get to the meaningful conversation. Thirdly and finally, on moral governance, because I think it's important to recognize, panel, that you cannot foresee all situations in the future. The world is chaotic and crazy. So once a politician has been elected to office, before they got into office, we did not know all of the decisions they would have to make, let alone all of the decisions that they would actually take in all of those circumstances. It is therefore right that we have a general impression of what moral framework they work within and what direction they direct and what direction they tend towards whenever it comes to those crunch time decisions. That means that when things do go wrong, because things do go wrong, not every policy works out perfectly, and when people get hurt, if we have somebody at the head who is consistent in their moral philosophy and is fair-minded, that is the point at which, when things go wrong, not a particular group is not disproportionately hurt by that mistake, and people are able to get along roughly fairly in the world, even when those mistakes are made. For a fairer, more just society and better politicians leading it, proud to stand in closing opposition.
Thank you very much for this fine speech. And to sum up the debate from the government side, I invite the government whip. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Perfect. I'm broadly going to cover 2 points in this speech. First of all, looking about the importance of character and whether or not that's important to your policy making. Second of all, looking at the broader principle about informed consent and its role within democracy. I'm going to weigh the bench at the end. Okay, first of all, let's talk about the importance of character then. I think there are a couple of things that we want to say here. First of all, note in general, or as a response to a lot of the material that we get from OP, that the motion specifies that we're talking about personal identity and private actions. I think that means that when OO stands up and tells you about things like conflict of interest, things that are going to directly affect your ability to carry out public office, I don't necessarily think that these are private actions. I think private actions looks like things like paparazzi following you. I think it looks like the media publicizing things like Dominic Cummings's violation of breaking of lockdown violations. I think that is probably private actions. I think someone having a conflict of interest is probably not a private action. I think we'll engage with them at their best anyways, even if that's not the case. I think second of all, this idea of tabloid media and these different types of media reporting on different things, I think there are a couple of things to note. I think one, note that even if tabloids are symmetric and they're not going to change to talk about policy or whatever, if they don't talk about public interests, I think they still pollute the overall discourse, right? They still dilute the pool of discussion about policy and policy decisions by throwing in these additional things. I think even if they don't transfer to talk about politicians' policies, I think we would prefer them to be gossiping about some other celebrities or whatever, so they're not getting involved in politics whatsoever. I think those harms still stand. Okay, let's look more specifically at some of what we get told by both of the opposition teams then. Because I think, first of all, we want to deal with this idea that your identity is going to inform your policy, right? We get a couple of different arguments in this. Opening tells us that your identity informs your policy more than lies or what you say your policies are, and CO talks a lot about minority groups and how that informs your policies. I think one, note that we think that your actual policies are probably more relevant to this than your minority background, right? In that we think it's very possible for you to do something that is counterintuitive or harmful to other people from the same background as you, and we would prefer people to be elected on the grounds of their actual policies as opposed to virtue signaling. I think note that there's not necessarily a correlation between your political interests and your private interests, and I think that's because politicians have a very direct tendency to do what they think is popular, right? Note this goes a couple of ways. I think it looks like one, Tim Farron in the UK having a very Christian background, and he was attacked a lot on that, and yet it didn't inform his policy whatsoever. And he made a commitment that his Christianity would not inform his policy making for as long as he was leader of the Liberal Democrats, and it didn't. I think it also goes the other way. It looks like Kamala Harris, right? It looks like her being black, and yet not winning a big portion of the black vote in the Democratic primaries, primarily because she had really bad policies for people from those minority backgrounds, and also because she had engaged in systematic discrimination against black people in her role as a prosecutor, right? People can absolutely go against the interests of their own groups if they think that it's going to be good for their political standings. Kanye West just announced that he wants to run for president today. I think he would be absolutely awful for black voters. Note that he's a supporter of Trump and a Republican. I would far rather have someone like Bernie Sanders than Kanye West, despite him being white. Okay, I think on the comparative then, when we compare to policy, I think sure, you can lie about policy, but I think this is only true to some extent in that you still have either a track record and you also want to save your skin. Note that if you go and do a complete 180 on what you're saying your policies are going to be, you're probably just not going to get elected next time. The Lib Dems did this with tuition and fees in the UK. They got absolutely screwed over and decimated in the next election when they lost almost all their seats. And yeah, policy has its own record as well. I think we had a few other attempts to give justification for this, though, right? I think one, we get told about you have a track record elsewhere in other jobs. I think that your track record in other jobs is probably not necessarily always relevant, right? If you bankrupt those companies or whatever. And I think that this is because of the reason that George says, actually, in his LO speech. I think it's because you can have great advisors that give you great policies, even if you yourself are like terrible at economics and have bankrupted companies in the past. I think if your policies come from your advisors and they are great, then cool, go ahead. Like, enact those policies. We don't care if you as an individual have no economic knowledge whatsoever. We get told about this idea of role models, and then this gets brought up again in CO with the Justin Trudeau blackface stuff. I think what's important to note is that, like, if there's a disparity between someone's individual actions and their policy, then we probably prefer the policy making decisions to be prioritized over their personal backgrounds, right? I think also this cuts work both ways. Note that if they are note that if they claim that the mainstream media is going to report on things like this, then the mainstream media is probably also going to report on things like past drug use and the stuff that they previously said only gets reported in tabloid media. I think that these are relevant to the same extent, and they don't do nearly enough work to justify any difference. Let's talk about the principle now, right? Because OO in particular gives us probably some of the strongest material from Bench when they talk about how you deserve to have all the relevant info in order to make an informed decision for informed consent to be relevant. I think note their justification in Hannah's response to George's POI about lawyers, right? And they tell you that the same doesn't apply to lawyers because they are representing someone else's views, not their own views. I think that the same is true of politicians, particularly when we give you concrete examples and concrete reasons why politicians will do things that go against their own interests or the interests of like individuals from similar groups of them, if they do so for to like get into a particular political group or gain the vote of someone from a particular political background. I think we tell you about the right to non-discrimination as well, but I think we tell you that the role of a politician is simply to represent someone else, but on a much larger scale than lawyers. We think that they are accountable to the people, and they're supposed to represent the people as in other people. If they choose to represent their own beliefs, then this will be represented in their policy decisions. If they don't represent their own beliefs, then it won't be represented in their policy decisions. And as such, we don't think it's particularly relevant if what they're doing actively helps to improve the lives of other people. I think additionally, we take their whole principle of informed consent and look at it much further, right? And then we tell you that having an election every 4 or 5 years isn't realistically consent. What you need is to be consistently scrutinized through mechanisms that George is telling you about, like surgeries, etc. And that this is what representative democracy is. You elect someone to represent you, and they have to represent you consistently. We think this is probably a lot more important, in that even if you can lie in elections or whatever, as OO says, you're not able to lie in your actual policy-making decisions. And these are the mechanisms where you are held to account for your actual policies, right? I think when we tell you about the principle of people needing to consent in these cases, and so they are no longer able to do so because they don't have to consult with the electorate anymore, I think that we take the debate on this alone, that we get absolutely no response to this from CO. Finally, to weigh the bench, I think there are a couple of things that we do better than them. These are the most important things. I think we address their critical flaws. In that, one, they look at outcomes in terms of like helping liberals and the left, which means that they don't engage with the OO principle of informed consent and that informed consent regardless of outcomes. I think we tell you what the real comparative is, and I think that we look at upholding democracy. So we not only engage far, far better with the opposition case about the principle of informed consent and democracy, but I think we also tell you why we think that improves regardless of outcomes and regardless of what OG spends so much of their time talking about, which is probably a strategic error on their part. CG, thank you.
Thank you very much for this fine speech. And for the last speech of the debate, I invite the opposition whip here.